America is the greatest nation on earth because of our trust in God and a free enterprise system that allows us to own and operate businesses that form the backbone of our economy. Small Business Journal explores how small businesses stay vibrant, relevant, and profitable through the ups, downs, and crazy surprises that entrepreneurship always provides. And now, here is your host, serial entrepreneur and small business champion, Burnell Taylor.
I started my first business in May 1979. I had a partner named Lynn Roundy, and he and I were good friends. We started a company called Graphic Center, doing graphics and screen printing and offset printing. And since then, I have been involved in over 30 different businesses in my career as a serial entrepreneur. But the thing that you may not be aware of is that the greatest success I've ever had, the greatest partnership I've ever had, actually started 4 years before 1979 in 1975. Exactly 48 years ago today, on February 28th, 1975, I knelt across a sacred altar in a holy temple of God with RaNae Barney. Together we entered into a covenant before God, angels, and witnesses that we would cleave to one another and none else, and becoming companions and helpmates as we counseled together in love and righteousness. We were then sealed by the holy priesthood as husband and wife for time and all eternity. As members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we believe that families can be eternal and that family relationships do not end at death. Because of our common focus on Christ and an eternal perspective, my relationship with RaNae Barney has been the greatest partnership I've ever had. She is the joy of my life and the anchor to my soul. RaNae, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
First of all, RaNae, let's have people get acquainted with you because you've been kind of behind the scenes on my podcast. Tell us a little bit about where you're from, your upbringing, that sort of stuff, so people can know RaNae Barney.
Sure. I was raised in American Fork, Utah. I had very good parents. They were not especially religious, but they were kind and loving. And my dad was very much a company man. He did not have any entrepreneurial bones in his body, but he was a good man and took good care of our family. My mom also worked some. And so when I married Burnell and all that played out, it was very different from what I was used to.
I remember when I had a job as a custodian in a junior high school when I was going to college. And my father-in-law, RaNae's dad, also worked for the school district. And we were one day talking and he said, isn't this just a great job? No responsibility, no obligation, just get your paycheck, do your job. And the only thing you really have to worry about is if a toilet seat falls on your hand. And that, my thinking was absolutely the opposite of that. I wanted to take risks. I wanted to jump off a cliff. I wanted to go do something adventurous. And, RaNae and I talked about it after we left her home that day. And anyway, little did she know, or I know, what we were in for. It was quite a ride. So after 4 years of marriage, we were married in 1975. After just 4 years, I started my first business. And I've said before on this podcast that being an entrepreneur is one of the toughest jobs that there is in the world. But the one that I know of is tougher than that is being the entrepreneur's wife. So RaNae, tell us about what that felt like.
So he was working for our church. We had a steady paycheck. But he was bored there. And he came home one day and said, "What do you think about me going out on my own?" And I wasn't especially excited about it, but at the same time, I wanted him to follow his dreams and spread his wings and fly. And I cried in the shower the day that he put in his notice. And I knew it was going to be tough, but I hoped it would be worth it, and it has been. Now I can look back on it.
Yeah, it's easier when you look back, isn't it?
Yeah.
So at that stage, we'd had a couple of babies. We had a mortgage and a house payment. We had some debt, not excessive, but we had debt. And I remember, you said you cried in the shower. I remember having diarrhea for a week.
TMI.
Too much information. I was just so nervous and afraid. And what happened is that the graphics business, my side of the business, was great. My partner's, Lynn Roundy, his business was really terrible because owning a printing company is really hard to make a profit. And so only a few weeks after we started this partnership, we became full partners, and therefore I took on the burden of the printing press as well. And then neither of us got a paycheck, either Lynn or I. And that was really tough on you.
Yeah, there were times when it was supposed to be payday, and Brunel would come home from work and I'd say, okay, did you bring the paycheck? And quite often there was nothing. It was delayed. But sometimes it would be half a paycheck, sometimes just $100. And I had my grocery list made out, and I would go to the store and have to cross half things off my list and hope I could get them the next time.
And eventually we got to the point where RaNae came to me one day. I remember this, and she said, maybe I should go to work because we had committed before we were married, that that she would be a stay-at-home mom, and that was a huge issue with us.
Yeah, it was very hard. I did not want to go to work, but we were in a pretty desperate way. But Brunel came up with what later became a famous saying in our marriage. He said, you don't need to go to work unless we're down to beans and water. And there were times that we were close to that, but not ever enough for me to have to go to work. And so for 48 years, I've been a stay-at-home mom. He was always able to provide, and I'm so grateful.
What memories? As you're talking about those paychecks, I remember one day bringing home a check for $50, and our paycheck was supposed to be $500. And there were some very, very lean, skinny times. So RaNae, what do you think was the biggest challenge for you to be an entrepreneur's wife?
The instability, just not knowing what to expect and trying to run a household, and just having the faith that things would work out, and they did, but it was still some pretty worrisome years.
And what was the best part?
The best part was when things did go well. And we had so many adventures. In fact, I came up with a saying, life with Brunel is an everyday adventure, and I love it. And I still do, even all these years later. It's never boring. And he's so passionate about what he does that it makes me happy to see him happy in his work.
But you've had to have a lot of compassion and forgiveness and patience like crazy in order to have that work.
Yes, for sure.
Spouses of entrepreneurs are often risk adverse. A few not so, but most are. They want to be able to count on that paycheck coming in and knowing that things are going to work out. And coming from the background that you did, honey, are there any secrets you could give to some other spouse that may be struggling with putting up with an entrepreneurial, crazy-brained person?
I think just, like I said, having faith in what you were doing. And I really learned how to budget and get by on not very much. I made all of our own food from scratch, and pretty much still do because I actually enjoy it. So we didn't go out to eat much, and we didn't, we lived very small, but we learned how to manage money. And we were very careful not to take on too much debt for the most part. So.
And tell us the time when that was especially hard as far as me taking risks.
Yeah, in 2001, we had paid off our home a few years before that, and we had accelerated the payments so that we could be debt-free, mortgage-free. And we he bought a building in Provo, and it was a huge building and a huge debt. And we had to mortgage our home. It wasn't very much, but it was still more than I wanted to mortgage it for, because it was such great peace of mind. And then after we signed all the papers and bought the building, 9/11 hit, and the economy tanked, and our business went down, and just things were working out like we had hoped. But I think about 10 years later, we put the building up for sale, and it did sell. So we didn't ever have to have it hurt our credit. We didn't make much profit when it sold, but we at least got out from under it.
Actually, we didn't make a nickel in profit. That was a terrible investment. It just never worked right. And we didn't succeed in filling up the building. And, we used it as a tool, but it was a very expensive tool. And that had repercussions even in later years after that, because of the debt we then had on the house. So let's shift a little bit away from entrepreneurship and shift over to marriage itself. So, honey, through the years, we've learned some stuff that we think are secrets that we wish other couples could know. Just let's talk a little bit about the keys to a happy marriage that you may not hear in a marriage counseling session.
First and foremost is keeping Christ at the center of our marriage. We've always said companion prayer and family prayer, and we've looked to Christ when things were hard, and we managed our family based on our religion. We had charity for each other, which is the pure love of Christ, and it doesn't get any better than that. We kept comedy in our marriage every day. This good man makes me laugh even now, and every day he compliments me. He tells me I'm pretty still. He says how good the meal was. He says how nice the house looks. After we've been with people, he'll say, I love how you interact and how you ask questions and get to know people. He's my greatest cheerleader, and he always has been. And I've always tried to be his greatest cheerleader. There are enough critics in the world, but we need to be our spouse's greatest cheerleader.
So talk about the C's. What are they again?
Christ, comedy, compliment, and charity. And that has really worked for us. It's not that things have always been easy. Brunel was so good through the years when our kids were little, and we had toddlers and teenagers. And I can remember having an especially stressful day, and he would walk in from work, and I didn't even know what his day had been like yet, which was probably stressful too. But he was so sensitive to my needs and my feelings and my emotions that he would say, come on. And he would haul me in the other room, and he'd say, tell me what's going on. And I would eventually tell him and break down, and he would get it out of me. He could make me open up, and it was huge. It was a big deal in our marriage. And he would go back out. He would leave me in the room to have a good cry and get refreshed. And he would go back out, take care of the kids, get dinner on, and until I was ready. And then I was renewed, and we could do it again.
Another thing that we've learned is that there's so much of this. This is a saying that RaNae came up with just recently, actually. It says, there's so much of this that doesn't matter. It's laughable. And I think that even though that's a recent thing that she came up with, we've kind of lived that most of our lives. We have refused to play the game of bigger and faster and better and more than the neighbor has. We've learned to live small. And when we returned from our mission in Uganda, we came back and we didn't own a key to anything. We had sacrificed quite a bit to go. And we didn't have a car. We didn't have a house. We'd sold the house because of my taking debt on the house. We'd sold the house so we could get out of debt. And we came back and we just squatted in my dad's apartment that's inside of a barn, a metal barn in Mapleton, Utah. And then we just tried to figure stuff out. But because of what we had learned in Uganda about living small on our mission, we realized that the happiest people in the world have often the least stuff. And we learned that stuff smothers happiness, and that we didn't want to be smothered again. We didn't want to have even what we did have before our mission. We didn't want to have that again. And so eventually we figured out a way to actually buy this barn from which we're talking to you now. And we converted it into what we call the party barn. And it's a great place for a family to come because we got gobs of space, as you can imagine, in a barn. But we also have a very small apartment. It's just 2-bedroom, 1-bath apartment. And we love living that way. You want to say anything about that?
Yes. I think that Pernell and I have both been very blessed with an eternal perspective. In fact, on our headstone, we wanted to read, "Eternal marriage is our mansion, well furnished with family." And when I think of that, just those few simple words, it helps me remember what's most important. It's keeping our covenants, being true to each other. And when we were in Uganda, we only took 2 suitcases each for 18 months. And before we left, we simplified and liberated. We got rid of so much stuff that we had accumulated in all those years of marriage. So it was very freeing. And when we got to Uganda, we could see how people could live much, much simpler than we ever dreamed. And yet they were happy. And I remember when we first came home from our mission, we went to Costco and we both just stood in the aisle and cried because of the abundance. And the stores over in Uganda, we would walk down the aisles and sometimes they would have enough, but most of the time, half the shelves were empty. A lot of times they couldn't give us change back, so they'd give us a pencil or something else that they can find, but we got used to it and we learned to live very small, and we still do. And we're both thankfully the same way. We're not into stuff, and we're so grateful that we have the eternal perspective for eyes to see of what matters most.
So clean water, a bed to sleep in, indoor plumbing is quite a luxury. Clothes to wear. RaNae, even when we were on our mission, she would hang up our clothes because we didn't have a dryer, of course. And since then, we came back and we got a washer and a dryer and all that stuff, and she still hangs up clothes. And it's just I can't think that's kind of an indicator of living small, that we can live simple and small and not allow that stuff to smother us.
Yeah, I don't know why I still do that. Maybe it's just because it's endearing, because I had to do it on our mission. But there's just something about it that it's weird, I know, but I like it.
Another thing that we did that seemed to work was we called it mini moons. And we would, especially because we had 6 kids, in the middle of raising 6 kids, I think mostly for RaNae's sake, but also for mine, we both needed to just escape and go and just be boyfriend and girlfriend again for a couple of days, if possible. Usually those were just overnighters, but what year was it we went to Europe? I can't remember.
In the 90s, we got some family to watch all 6 kids, and we went to Europe for 2 weeks and left them. And it was a wonderful trip. Of course, we missed our kids, but it was so refreshing and renewing for us as a couple.
Yep. And even now, we don't have a reason to get away from anything because our children are raised, and we're most of the time alone here in the party barn. But we still like to get away and go on dates. I think Friday night dates became a sacred time for us through all of those years, especially in those hectic years of raising kids. Don't always have to wear the mom and dad hat, because those hats get kind of heavy sometimes.
They do. And the best advice that my mom ever gave me was make your husband a priority. the kids will grow up and leave. But if you have no relationship left with your husband because you focus so much on the kids, which you should to a point, but at the same time, those dates and those weekend getaways can really keep you close and help you remember what made you fall in love in the first place. And so we've done that, and it has really paid off now. I can say that with all my heart, that we are closer than ever because we have made each other a priority.
So most small businesses fail within the first 5 to 7 years. That's a statistic. And sadly, about 50% of marriages in the US end in divorce, which is the 6th highest rate of divorce in the world. And we have to qualify that because both RaNae and I understand that there are times when divorce is necessary. Personal opinion, I think that those times are pretty small by comparison to how many divorces happen. You know, we talk about the 7-year itch, you know, that's kind of when divorces seem to happen. 20 years seems to be another time when, you know, marriages seem to break apart. But keeping the band together, you know, Simon and Garfunkel broke up way too soon. They're still my favorite music, but they just couldn't keep it together long enough. And sadly, that happens way too often in marriage. So if you're one of those whose marriage is kind of rocky and you're thinking maybe I ought to, you know, step away from this or change him or her in for a new model, think seriously about that, because it's very hard, having been married for 48 years now, it's very hard to express what it feels like to be married to a queen and to have the love that I have for this woman. Who has been my cheerleader and my helpmeet and my best friend. And, you know, she's not my wife, I'm her husband. And I'm honored to be her husband. And just so that you understand that our marriage has not always been perfect, you know, we've had very few arguments. We've had disagreements, but there's a difference between a disagreement and an argument. And with speaking of 7 years, you know, we had been married about 7 years. We had moved into our first home that I actually built. And I remember it seems like a Sunday. We've had a house full of kids. They were getting ready, I think, for church. And it was just kind of a confusing, hectic time. And I said something really mean to RaNae. And it was the sort of mean that I typically never used in our marriage or elsewhere. But it's the environment I had been raised in as a child. You know, we would often exchange barbs and sarcasm in my family. But I said something mean to RaNae and I walked away. And as I was walking away, I felt this thing in the back of my head, just below my skull. It felt like a whack. And this voice came into my head very clearly and said, "Burnell, who do you think you're talking to? That is your queen." And I still cry when I think of that moment because I realized something that was an aha moment that I hadn't thought about too much before, that I was not married just to a woman, I was married to a queen, and that I needed to treat her like that. And so I turned around, walked back to her, apologized, and you know, she was still mad for a while, and you know, we both took time to get over that. But I don't think since then that I've done, you know, given her that kind of a barb again. So we have to cut each other slack. We do make mistakes. We stumble all the time. And I'm satisfied that RaNae has had to put up with more of my dealings than I've had to put up with hers.
I don't know about that. I've got my own quirks. And it seems like whenever I start getting critical of Burnell, my faults are magnified. So I'm humbled and I just think, okay, I just need to, you know, be patient and realize that I've got my own faults and stop trying to change him and work on your own self and realize this is part of life. We're not perfect and we just have to hang on and stay together and help remember what made us fall in love in the first place.
Well, as you look at your business and where you are, you know, trying to run your company and employees and culture and you know, the profit and loss statements and all of that stuff. it's a really good idea to pause, step back, and say, what is really important here? What matters? If we realize, every one of us, that it's all relationships. I say this in business all the time. It's all relationships. It's not dollars and cents nearly as much as relationships. And if things are not right at home, if our personal life is messed up, the likelihood of us really succeeding in business and in other things that we think are important is much diminished, because, there's a train wreck at home, and the train wreck kind of follows us into business. And that's not, even if our business failed, if we didn't succeed, so what? If our marriage is still intact, if we have happiness and peace there, then all the rest of the minutia doesn't matter so much. So on this 48th wedding anniversary of RaNae and I hope that you'd take time to count your own blessings, that the personal relationships you have with those that you love. Maybe you'll go home and kiss or hug your spouse a little tighter, be a little more grateful. And I guess I will conclude kind of how we began, that I think one of the main things in our marriage is that when we got married, we both had the common view that we were headed toward heaven, that we were pointed toward God and Christ and our shared religious beliefs. And that when you get married, even though you may start here, and all marriages do, no marriage starts like this, but when marriage starts like this, but you're all pointing toward that same goal, toward God, eventually you will come together. And the way that makes me feel, the way that makes us feel, we are so one that we don't very often say I, we say we, almost always. And I'm eternally grateful for this amazing queen. Thanks for being my guest today, honey.
You're welcome. I'm grateful for you and all the sensitivity and kindness that you've shown me through the years. And we've learned lessons together and had to have charity, but we're happier than ever.
If you like today's podcast, please subscribe to Small Business Journal wherever you like listening to podcasts. Until next time, defy gravity, shoot for the moon, and thank God for the freedom to run your own business in the greatest nation on earth.